In order to understand why Brendan McConville's DNA on exhibit HGS/3 is important, we have to understand how the jacket was connected to the shooting on the 9th of March. And that was done by reference to GSR analysis, gunshot residue analysis. The Crown identified particles on the jacket which a Crown expert named Angela Shaw concluded were conducive with gunshot residue. Angela Shaw examined the coat found in the boot of the Citroen Saxo motor vehicle. She found what she referred to as high levels of antimony and tin particles on the outer layer of the coat. And a significant number of those particles had antimony and tin in a 1-to-1 ratio. So they had been fused together, two particles of differing metals fused together, indicative, well, I use that term reservedly for reasons I'll explain in a moment, but suggestive of these particles having been ejected at high temperatures and therefore conducive or indicative of having been discharged from a firearm. Angela Shaw concluded that these particles were highly unusual and that there was no other possible source for these particles other than mercuric ammunition. And she considers other possible sources, including bearing metals, pewter metals, I don't know what they are either, but she considers another series of possible sources and concludes that none of them could have given rise to the kinds of particles that were found on the front of exhibit HGS/3. Now, in order to understand the forensic evidence, we have to remind ourselves of what was seized from the scene around Lismore Manor in the immediate aftermath of this shooting, and remembering the lip of grass behind Lismore Manor, which in our second video we addressed as the principal site of the shooter at the time of the shooting, and the place where the Crown forensic experts concluded that the shot that killed Stephen Carroll was fired from. We're looking here at the passages of the judgment that deal with the forensic evidence in relation to the particles found on the coat. It deals initially in paragraph 55 with some of the non-contentious areas of forensic evidence regarding those particles. So it begins that it was not in dispute between the forensic experts called by the Crown and the defence, so the Crown experts being a Miss Shaw and a Mr. Macmillan, and the defence expert Mr. Doyle, that the firing of a gun results in the formation of particulate residues from the ammunition fired. And this is known as GSR, sometimes known as CDR, being cartridge residue. It points out that these may be transferred onto other surfaces by direct physical contact with a source of residue, for example, a spent cartridge, a recently fired gun, or a surface contaminated with residues, which is known in relation to GSR as secondary transfer, much like in relation to DNA. The judgment considers the testing process for GSR. It indicates that GSR can be recovered from a surface by a process of taping or by vacuuming. And it's important to remember that this judgment is reflecting on the evidence as it emerges in the course of the trial, and we will look at the way in which this evidence unfolded in the course of the trial in later videos. The examination by Mrs. Shaw and Mr. Macmillan of the spent cartridge LH7 showed that the GSR contained combinations of antimony, tin, and mercury. You'll remember that the spent cartridge LH7 was one of the two cartridges seized from the scene of the shooting on the grassy area at the rear of Lismore Manor. And this GSR contained combinations of antimony, tin, and mercury. It's important to note that there are three ingredients there: antimony, tin, and mercury. The evidence given by Ms. Shaw then distinguished between two categories of particles, or two ways of describing particles in relation to gunshot residue. She says she used the term characteristic as referring to particles containing the full complement of key elements in types of GSR. So characteristic would mean that all the relevant ingredients of a particular ammunition would be found in the particles recovered from a particular surface. So where all of the constituent elements are recovered in the course of a sample, they will be called characteristic. So the judgment reads, she used the term characteristic as referring to particles containing the full complement of key elements in types of GSR. So where all the necessary ingredients are there. Where particles do not contain all or a combination of some of the key elements, she referred to these particles as indicative of GSR. So where some of the relevant ingredients from the gunshot residue are missing, where some of the key elements are missing from the particles, they are referred to as consistent. So there is a distinction drawn between particles being characteristic of GSR and consistent with GSR. Characteristic particles are those which contain all the relevant elements, and consistent particles are those which contain where some of the elements are missing. Mr. Doyle, in his evidence, this is the evidence for the defendant, criticised the widespread use of the term indicative and the misuse of the word characteristic. The judge concludes that nothing in my view turns on the terminological expressions used, and I consider the words indicative and consistent for present purposes can be used interchangeably. So even though there is a very neat definition set up by the experts in the course of the evidence, the judge then considers that the two terms are interchangeable for these purposes. So when he considers the evidence against Brendan McConville, he concludes that really the distinction is not relevant to matters that he has to rule on. She carried out an examination of the coat found in the boot of the Citroen Saxo car. Miss Shaw found a high level of particles containing the element antimony tin on the outer surface of the jacket, with the majority present on the front and sleeves. So she found a high level of particles where antimony and tin had been fused together on the outer surface of the jacket, and the majority present on the front and the sleeves. She found a moderate level of similar particles inside the waist area. Some of the particles contained lead and copper. Ms. Shaw said that a further analysis to semi-qualitative, Ms. Shaw said that a further analysis to semi-qualitative measure the levels of antimony tin showed a large proportion of the particles contained antimony tin in a 1-to-1 ratio. So I'm not quite sure of the wording there. It's possible that there is a typographical error. But what is being suggested is that there were particles on the front of the jacket and on the front and sleeve of the jacket that contained antimony tin in a 1-to-1 ratio, meaning that there was an equal part of antimony and tin fused within the particle. The morphology indicated that the particles were fusions of elements brought about at a very high temperature. This morphology was consistent with the particles having a firearm source. Samples were taken from inside the surface of the jacket using abrasive tape to recover residues. A very high number of particles comprising antimony and tin were found. They were, in Mrs. Shaw's view, indicative of type 7 residues. Just pausing there, type 7 refers to a series of categorizations that are used by the Forensic Service of Northern Ireland in order to categorize particular kinds of ammunition. And if we cut back to our second video, in which we considered the nature of the ammunition found at Lismore Manor, we know that, just looking there at LH7, an empty casing from the grass area, and that this LH7 was a spent brass cartridge case with the head stamp NY 1982, indicating that the cartridge was of Yugoslavian origin and had been manufactured in 1982. So Shaw's conclusion here is that these particles are consistent with firings from Forensic Science Services Type 7 ammunition, and Type 7 ammunition would have included the spent brass cartridge case LH7, which was seized from the grass area around Lismore Manor. This is the concluding paragraphs of the judgment, which deal with the GSR. The judge says the antimony tin particles on the coat in the car were indicative of GSR. Mercury fulminate ammunition can produce antimony tin particles. So mercuric fulminate means that the ammunition uses mercury as part of the charge which sends the bullet through the rifle barrel. The very large occurrence of solely antimony tin particles without any evidence of mercury is an unusual finding. Now, this is an extremely important point that we are going to be exploring further, but you will remember that Miss Shaw's findings were that the particles were, in her language, let me just get the paragraph back up. In her language, they were characteristic particles and that some of them were indicative. That means that in relation to some of the particles, in fact most of the particles, there were missing one consistent element which would have made them characteristic GSR particles. And the obvious element that was missing, because if you remember the analysis showed up antimony tin particles, is mercury. There was no mercury particles transferred to the coat. This, the judge concludes, was an unusual finding. It has been found in casework in Northern Ireland that it is not unusual for mercury to be undetectable in GSR produced by mercuric fulminate ammunition, a point borne out by the evidence of Mr. Macmillan and Miss Shaw, which I accept on that point. So what the defence were suggesting in the course of examining Miss Shaw's evidence was that the fact that there was no mercury transferred to HGS/3 at all, and given that LH7 was mercury fulminate ammunition, this was an extremely unusual finding in the context of GSR analysis, and one which pointed away to the particles being particles which had transferred to HGS/3 as a result of the firing of LH7, being the spent cartridge. Nonetheless, the prosecution adduced evidence that in casework in Northern Ireland, it's not unusual for mercury to be undetectable in GSR produced by mercuric fulminate ammunition. In the Wallace article, so it's here that the Crown began to adduce articles and evidence in support of their proposition. In the Wallace article, Mr. Wallace himself, having considerable Northern Ireland experience in this field, so that was, I should have read that with different emphasis. The Wallace article, which Miss Shaw relied upon in the course of her evidence, was an expert who demonstrated that there were examples where mercuric fulminate ammunition had been fired and yet no mercury particles had been transferred to a nearby garment. Such scientific research has been carried out, as shown by Wallace, shows the presence of some detectable amounts in the ammunition tested in those experiments, producing larger number of particles than in the case of Zechner's experiments, in which smaller numbers of particles, not evidencing any mercury, were produced. So in Zechner's articles, Zechner is an Israeli gunshot residue expert. It was found that in all cases involving test firings with mercuric fulminate ammunition, mercury particles transferred in the course of the firing. However, the criticism that's levelled at Zechner, or the observation of Zechner's work by the judge in this passage, is that in Zechner's articles, a relatively small number of particles were transferred. And so it's perhaps not surprising that where you have a lower number of particles, it may be less likely that mercury fulminate was transferred. It goes on, the articles then support the proposition that mercuric fulminate ammunition can on occasions produce gunshot particles without a trace of mercury. So just to emphasize the point, the particles found on the front of HGS/3 did not contain a trace of mercury, whereas mercury was the fulminate primer used in the ammunition that was found at the firing site. So there is a key ingredient missing from the front of exhibit HGS/3, which was present in the ammunition found at the firing site. Therefore, there was, in the course of the trial, a key issue around whether the particles found on the front of HGS/3 were in fact gunshot residue from those bullets. I'm going to skip forward very slightly and point out this very important line. Wallace's article did not produce data from which one could draw a scientific conclusion that when one increases the number of particles found, one will find more evidence of mercury. There is insufficient data to found a statistical scientific basis for such a proposition. What can be said is that the type of articles found on the coat in the car represent a type which can on occasion be produced as a result of the use of mercuric fulminate ammunition. So the missing piece, in my view, from this paragraph is the lack of any evidence that where you increase the number of particles transferred in the course of a test firing, then you will increase the chances of mercury fulminate particles mercury particles being transferred as part of the gunshot residue. So the important line, I think, is that Wallace's article did not produce data from which one could draw the scientific conclusion that when one increases the number of particles found, one will find more evidence of mercury. So one question we would like to explore is whether when you fire this particular ammunition, mercuric fulminate ammunition of the kind found at Lismore Manor, when you undertake test firings in which large numbers of particles are transferred, so comparable to our case, because in our case a large number, in what in Shaw's words, a high number of GSR particles were transferred, where you have such high levels of transfer, does it become more likely that mercury particles will be transferred? In my view, if you could demonstrate an upward correlation between the number of particles transferred in the course of a test firing and the chances of recovering mercury particles, then the scientific conclusion, which the judge finds to be lacking in the work of Wallace and Zechner, would be challenged. There would be data found, there would be data on which to found a statistical scientific basis for the assertion that where you have high numbers of particles, as you have in the case of HGS/3, then the chances of mercury being transferred are increased. And I think if we were able to demonstrate that, then the conclusion in this paragraph would be upset. That concludes our work for the time being on the scientific material. In the videos to come, we're going to be looking at some more of the witness evidence and looking at some of the most important witness evidence, which is given by an anonymized witness in this case, who's known as Witness M. And it's Witness M's evidence and the twists and turns that that evidence takes, which makes this case all the more remarkable. Thank you very much.